Have you ever been judged by your appearance? Have you ever felt invisible in a place where everyone looked at you with contempt? Now imagine that all this happens before the eyes of a living legend, and no one has any idea what is about to happen. What started as a simple food order turned into one of the biggest poetic justice twists you've ever seen. A story that proves that arrogance always has its price, and that destiny takes turns in unimaginable ways. A luxurious restaurant, well-dressed customers, hurried waiters, and outside, a tired, hungry man looking inside with hope. He didn't want money, he didn't want alms, he just wanted a plate of food. But what he received was contempt, humiliation, and cruel words that cut deeper than hunger itself. The looks of disgust, the whispers of contempt, and the arrogant tone of the waiter made it clear. In that place, appearance was worth more than character. But what no one knew was that, at a discreet table in the corner of the restaurant, a man in a sweatshirt and cap observed everything, silent, attentive, and ready to act. When the manager kicked out the homeless man with cruel words, thinking there would be no consequences, he had no idea who was watching, and much less the impact that attitude would have on your life, because justice may take time, but it always arrives. And this time it came in the form of Snoop Dogg. Seconds later, silence took over the restaurant. Little did the man everyone despised know that fate was about to turn the tables in ways no one could have imagined. And what happened afterwards? Good. This will leave your mouth open. It was a busy night in Los Angeles. The city lights reflected on the wet asphalt. The luxury cars parked in front of the restaurant indicated that this was an exclusive place, reserved for the few who could afford a refined gastronomic experience. The expensive perfume of customers mixed with the sophisticated aroma of the dishes served on impeccable crockery. The clinking of wine glasses and muffled laughter filled the elegant environment, where every detail exuded wealth and status. Outside, however, the reality was very different. A man with worn clothes and a tired look observed everything in silence. His eyes followed the waiters, who hurriedly balanced trays full of expensive dishes. His stomach was growling, and he could smell the food escaping through the door whenever someone entered or left. I didn't ask for much, just a dish, a chance to eat, a minimum of compassion amid the indifference of the world. He took a deep breath and gathered courage. He took a few hesitant steps and approached the restaurant door, trying not to attract too much attention. But it didn't take long for some looks to pierce through him like sharp blades. Customers laughed, raised their eyebrows, and whispered among themselves as if the mere presence of that man was a nuisance, a threat to the harmony of the environment. In the room, waiters circulated between the tables, pretending not to notice the man standing at the entrance. Until finally, one of them decided to intervene, an impeccably dressed young man, with an immaculate white apron and a look of pure arrogance. He approached with a forced smile, but his expression was clear. This place was not for everyone. "Sir, can I help you?" asked the waiter, but his voice had a hint of irony. The homeless man, cowering, tried to explain, "I just wanted something to eat, anything." His voice was weak, but there was dignity in his words. He wasn't there to beg for money or cause trouble. He just wanted some food. The waiter let out a dry laugh and looked around, as if he was about to tell a joke to the nearest customers. "This is not a charitable place, my friend. Maybe you'll find something at your level in a dumpster around the corner." The words were a blow. Some people laughed quietly, others just looked away, uncomfortable, but none of them did anything. The homeless man lowered his head, feeling the weight of humiliation. The hunger that led him there now shared space with shame, and it was at that moment, as the scene unfolded before everyone's eyes, that a man at a far-away table looked up. He observed every detail, analyzed every expression. His face was partially covered by his sweatshirt hood, but his eyes hid something that no one there noticed: a plan. That man was none other than Snoop Dogg. No one in the restaurant had noticed his presence. Sitting discreetly, with a cap covering part of his face, he followed everything in silence, and every cruel word, every look of contempt, every muffled laugh. All of this lit something inside him. He knew exactly what it was like to be underestimated, ignored, treated like he was worthless. And in that instant, he made a decision. Snoop Dogg leaned forward slightly, watching the homeless man hesitate, about to turn around and disappear into the cold night. The waiter, convinced that he had done his part in protecting the restaurant from an unwanted customer, turned to continue his work. But he had no idea what was about to happen, because, as the homeless man turned to leave, a firm voice echoed through the restaurant, cutting through the hubbub of the tables and freezing the moment in time. No, the waiter stopped. The closest customers looked, curious. The homeless man slowly turned around. Snoop Dogg was standing. The tension in the air was palpable. The silence that followed was almost deafening. The customers, who until then had been too busy with their own dinners and idle conversations, were now paying attention. The waiter blinked, confused, trying to understand what was happening. And it was there, at that exact moment, that everything began to change. Because what happened next? No one ever expected it. Silence hung in the air. The waiter, who seconds before exuded arrogance, now seemed unresponsive. The customers, who had previously been laughing, now looked on intently, waiting to see what would happen next. The homeless man, confused, looked at Snoop Dogg without understanding why this stranger was intervening. But what he heard next would completely change the course of that night. Snoop Dogg took a few steps towards the homeless man, his eyes fixed on the waiter. His presence, even without raising his voice, was powerful enough to make the entire room hold its breath. Anyone who knew Snoop knew that he was a man of attitude, someone who did not let injustices go unnoticed. He looked at the homeless man, assessing his expression, the way he held his hands, trying to contain the humiliation he had just suffered. And then, with a firm tone but without losing his cool, Snoop said something that made everyone in the restaurant gasp. "Now tell me, what do you think happened next? How would you react if you were in the homeless person's shoes? Or worse, what if you were that waiter? Did he already imagine the size of the mistake he had just made? I want to know your opinion. Comment below what you would do in this situation. Have you ever been through something similar? Have you ever seen someone treated unfairly just because of their appearance? Your opinion is very important, and I read every comment. Let's talk about it, because respect and empathy are fundamental anywhere. And don't forget, if this story moved you, leave a like, because it helps the channel a lot and shows YouTube that this type of content deserves to be seen by more people. If you are not yet registered, take the opportunity to sign up and activate the bell, because this story is far from over. What Snoop Dogg did next took everyone by surprise. The entire restaurant was in shock. The turnaround was so unbelievable that in the end, no one left the same way they entered. Want to know what happened next? So get ready, because the next part will leave you speechless. The man stopped for a moment, hesitant. The cold of the night had already punished his bones, but nothing hurt more than the indifference that followed him wherever he went. He was used to looks of contempt, to people moving aside so as not to have to face him, as if his mere presence were a nuisance, a mistake in the luxurious setting of that city. But still, something inside him insisted. Maybe this time someone would have a little compassion. Maybe this time things would be different. His face, marked by time on the streets, carried more than the hunger of that day. It was the look of someone who had already lost a lot, but who was still clinging to hope. The dirty and worn clothes betrayed the harsh reality he faced daily. His shoes, old and torn, no longer protected his feet from the cold asphalt. And yet, there he was, mustering up the courage to order a simple plate of food, such a basic gesture, but one that seemed so impossible to achieve. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, cautiously walking through the restaurant door. The smell of hot food filled his nostrils and made his stomach turn. The hunger was unbearable. His eyes roamed the room, taking in every detail: the shining chandeliers, the wine glasses being raised in joyful toasts, the cutlery gleaming in the warm light of the room. Everything there seemed so far from his reality, as if it were a world to which he would never belong. But he didn't want luxury. I wanted nothing more than a little dignity. He approached the counter, moving cautiously, trying not to draw too much attention. But it didn't take long for judgmental looks to turn his way. Some people frowned, others just pretended not to see him. But he felt every one of those looks. He felt the weight of rejection before he even heard the words that would come next. "Can I help?" The waiter's voice sounded cold, almost impatient. The man swallowed hard. He tried to stand his ground, but his voice was weak, almost a whisper. "I just wanted something to eat, anything." For a second there was silence. The waiter looked him up and down, and an ironic smile appeared on his face. He tilted his head slightly and crossed his arms. "What do you think this is? A soup kitchen?" The homeless man opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted before he could even form a sentence. "Look, I suggest you go look for food elsewhere. We can't just go around giving free dishes to anyone who walks through that door." He felt his face heat up. What had he expected? The answer was always this. It would always be this one. But this time, before he could lower his head and walk away, a voice came from behind him. "No." The entire restaurant seemed to freeze in time. The voice was calm, but carried an undeniable presence. It was a tone that didn't need to be loud to be heard. All eyes turned to the direction the voice was coming from, and that's when the homeless man turned around and saw Snoop Dogg standing. The waiter blinked a few times, confused. The closest customers interrupted their conversations, curious to understand what was happening. The homeless man, not knowing who that man in the sweatshirt and cap was, just stood there waiting for the worst. He was already used to being kicked out of places like that. But Snoop Dogg took a few steps forward, slowly approaching. The rapper's eyes met the waiter's, but he didn't say anything right away. His gaze, firm and unwavering, already conveyed more than any words could express. The tension in the atmosphere was palpable. Some people began to whisper among themselves, trying to understand why this man had decided to intervene. The waiter cleared his throat, trying to recover his posture. "Sir, is there a problem?" Snoop Dogg raised an eyebrow, as if the question were absurd. He then pointed to the homeless man next to him. "The problem is right in front of you." "But it's not him." The waiter frowned, not knowing how to react. Some customers held back their laughter, while others just watched in silence. The homeless man, in turn, still didn't understand exactly what was happening, but he felt that something was about to change. The waiter tried to regain control of the situation. "Sir, we're just following the house rules. We can't allow just anyone to come in here and order food," interrupted Snoop Dogg, crossing his arms, "because as far as I know, restaurants serve food. Or am I wrong?" The waiter was unresponsive for a moment. The homeless man, still not completely understanding the direction of the conversation, looked from one to the other, waiting to see how it would end. And it was at that moment that Snoop Dogg did something that no one expected. But before I continue, I want to hear from you. If you were in this homeless man's shoes, how would you feel? Have you ever been in a situation where you were treated differently just because of your appearance? Write the sentence here in the comments. "Respect comes before everything," to show that you support this cause. I read all the comments and want to know your opinion. And if this story has already made you curious, then hold on, because what Snoop Dogg did next was so shocking that no one there could believe what was happening. If you think you've seen it all, get ready, because the twist that comes next will surprise you. The waiter tried to compose himself, but the presence of Snoop Dogg there, staring at him firmly, destabilized his posture of superiority. He looked around, as if seeking support from the restaurant's customers, but many just watched in silence, curious to see where this was going. Some people held discreet smiles, recognizing the rap legend there in front of them, but others seemed uncomfortable, as if they wanted the situation to end as quickly as possible. The waiter cleared his throat, crossed his arms, and tried to maintain the arrogant tone he had used before. "Sir, as I was saying, we have rules here. These types of people," he gave a quick and dismissive look at the homeless, "are not part of our audience. If we make an exception for one, tomorrow we will have several here bothering our customers." Snoop Dogg smiled sideways, a short, humorless smile, the kind that precedes something big. He looked again at the homeless man next to him, who was now avoiding looking at anyone, feeling the weight of humiliation bearing down on him once again. "These kind of people," Snoop repeated, his voice carrying a tone of disbelief. The waiter swallowed hard, realizing that his words were being repeated so that everyone there would really understand the situation. That was when a new voice entered the conversation, cutting through the silence of the restaurant with an even colder and more impatient tone. "Any problems here?" The restaurant manager appeared behind the counter, a man in a dark suit, well-combed hair, and a calculating look. He seemed to be fed up with the situation before he even fully understood what was happening. He addressed the waiter directly, ignoring both the homeless man and Snoop Dogg, as if they didn't even exist. "I don't know why we're still having this conversation," he said, straightening his tie. "What is this guy still doing here?" The homeless man lowered his head, ashamed. His body was already ready to turn and walk out the door without saying anything else. He already knew how this story would end, because it was always like this. It always ended the same way. But Snoop Dogg didn't budge. He looked directly at the manager, and this time his expression wasn't just serious, it was sharp, carrying a weight that made anyone think twice before continuing to talk nonsense. The manager noticed this, but did not back down. "Sir, I don't know who you are," the manager lied, because of course he knew. "But we need to maintain a suitable environment for our customers. We have a reputation to uphold, and this individual is clearly not part of that environment." The tone was definitive, as if the decision had already been made, and there was nothing more to discuss. That's when Snoop Dogg took a step forward. It wasn't a threatening approach, but it was enough for the manager to feel his presence up close. "A suitable environment?" Snoop repeated, again challenging the word choice. "Does that mean treating people like trash, just because they're not dressed like you expect?" The manager sighed impatiently. He looked at the waiter as if to say, "Did you really make me leave the office for this?" "Look, sir, that's the way the world is. You can't solve everyone's problems. We have a standard to follow. If we let anyone in here, our restaurant loses value. And if you continue to insist, I will have to ask you all to leave." And that's when Snoop Dogg laughed. It was a short, low laugh, but enough to make the manager frown angrily. "So you want me to leave?" asked Snoop, crossing his arms. "Exactly," replied the manager, convinced. The entire restaurant watched intently. Some customers were just curious to see how far this scene would go, but others were already beginning to realize that they were witnessing something bigger, something that probably went viral on the internet faster than anyone there could have predicted. Snoop Dogg then looked at the homeless man, still standing there, not knowing if he should leave or wait for what would happen next. "Tell me something," Snoop said, his voice a little louder now so everyone in the restaurant could hear. "If this guy were here, well-dressed, sitting at one of these tables ordering the most expensive dish on the menu, would you treat him like that?" The manager blinked a few times, surprised by the question. If he could afford it, of course not. "Got it," Snoop nodded. "So if I want to pay for his meal, is the problem solved?" The manager hesitated. He didn't want to give in. He didn't want this beggar to have the right to sit there, to eat the same food as his refined customers. But now he was cornered. If he said no, he would make it clear that the problem was never money, but prejudice. The waiter looked at the manager, waiting for an answer. Customers waited. The homeless man waited. The manager bit his lip, trying to maintain his posture. If you want to pay, that's your choice," he said, clearly uncomfortable. "But we still have rules about client presentation. We cannot allow him to remain here wearing these clothes." Snoop Dogg smiled again. He already expected that answer. "Okay, then do me a favor," he said, taking his cell phone out of his pocket. "Call the restaurant owner." The manager opened his eyes wide, surprised by the demand. "What? You heard?" Snoop responded. "Call the owner, because I want to know if he approves of this policy of humiliation." Murmurs began among the customers. Some took out their cell phones, already starting to record. The tension in the air was almost palpable. The manager looked around, trying to gauge the situation. He knew this could get out of control, but what happened next? No one expected. And now I want to hear from you. What do you think should happen to this manager and this waiter? Do they deserve a lesson? Right here in the comments, respect above all. If you believe no one should be treated like this, I read all the comments and want to know your opinion. And if this story has already moved you, hold on, because the twist that comes next was so unbelievable that it sent the entire restaurant into shock. If you think you've seen it all, get ready. Because Snoop Dogg was just getting started. Silence spread throughout the restaurant. The manager, still trying to maintain his composure, looked around and realized that the eyes were no longer just on him and the homeless man. There was a new presence on the scene, a figure that until that moment had gone unnoticed, sitting discreetly at a table away, observing everything carefully. But now he stood up, slowly, almost calculatedly. The entire restaurant was on alert, even without knowing exactly what was happening. The customers stopped their conversations and looked in the direction of this tall man, wearing a dark hoodie and a cap, with a firm face but without showing anger. He didn't need to raise his voice or act impulsively. His presence alone carried a weight that no one there could ignore. The waiters exchanged nervous glances, as if they had suddenly realized that they were in the middle of something much bigger than just a nuisance at the restaurant's door. The manager, in turn, hesitated. Something inside him said that this man was not just anyone, but without immediately recognizing him, he maintained the same arrogant posture. The homeless man, without really understanding what was happening, remained still. He was used to being thrown out of places like this, but no one had ever stood up to his defense before. He looked at Snoop Dogg, not knowing whether to wait for help or more humiliation. Snoop took a few steps forward, keeping a slow, controlled pace. His dark eyes fixed on the manager, who swallowed hard but tried to maintain a firm stance. The rapper analyzed the situation for a moment, as if deciding the best way to act. "Do you know who I am?" asked Snoop, his voice calm but full of meaning. The manager frowned uncomfortably. He took a closer look at the face of the man in front of him, and then his eyes widened for a brief moment as he finally recognized who he was dealing with. But, in a defensive reflex, he soon disguised his surprise and tried to remain in control of the situation. "Does it matter?" he replied, trying to sound confident. "You are causing a scene and interfering with the operation of our restaurant." Snoop smirked. It wasn't a smile of humor, but one of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen. He crossed his arms and looked directly at the homeless man. "Let me ask you something, my brother," he said, ignoring the manager for a moment. "Are you here bothering anyone?" The homeless man hesitated, not knowing exactly how to respond. He opened his mouth, but couldn't say anything. Then he just shook his head in denial. Snoop turned to his manager again. "So, what's the problem?" The manager snorted, no longer patient. "The problem, sir, is that this man can't afford a meal here." Snoop Dogg raised an eyebrow. "Oh, yeah? And who said that?" The manager blinked a few times, confused by the question. "Well, look, did you ask him?" Snoop interrupted, tilting his head slightly to the side. The manager stuttered, and the waiter looked down, trying to avoid eye contact. The truth was that no one there had asked the homeless man anything. They just assumed he didn't deserve to be in that place. The manager's silence caused some customers to murmur among themselves. The atmosphere in the restaurant changed. The discomfort was now on the side of the manager and the waiter. Snoop Dogg then reached into his pocket and pulled out a wallet. He took out a black card and placed it on the counter, tapping it lightly with his fingers. "Here's the guarantee that his bill will be paid. Now tell me, what really is the problem?" The manager looked at the card, then at Snoop, and it was clear he didn't know what to do. The situation was no longer under his control. He knew that anything he said from that moment on could be used against him, especially with so many cell phones recording the scene. The waiter glanced at the manager, waiting for a command. But the man in the suit seemed completely stuck. He knew he couldn't just turn down Snoop Dogg's offer without exposing himself further. Snoop stepped aside and reached out to the homeless man. "Come with me, partner. Today you will have dinner here." The man hesitated. He looked at Snoop Dogg, then the manager, then the surrounding customers. It was still hard to believe this was happening. But Snoop kept his hand out, encouraging him to trust. Finally, with a mixture of fear and relief, the homeless man grabbed the rapper's hand and stepped forward. And it was at that moment that everything changed. The entire restaurant was in shock. The manager, still without reaction, saw Snoop Dogg and the homeless man walk past him as if his authority was no longer worth anything inside. The waiter lowered his head, feeling the weight of every judgmental look that was now turned against him. Customers watched the scene, some surprised, others uncomfortable. But one thing was certain. No one there would ever forget what had just happened. What if you were there? What would you do in this situation? Have you ever seen someone treated unfairly just because of their appearance? Write the sentence here in the comments, respect above all, to show that you do not tolerate this type of attitude. I read all the comments and want to know your opinion. And if you think this story is over, you are very mistaken. Because what happened next left everyone speechless. Get ready, because the twist that comes next was so unbelievable that it made the entire restaurant question everything they thought they knew about respect and justice. The entire restaurant was silent. The manager, who until seconds ago felt in control of the situation, now seemed lost. The waiter, still holding the tray in his hands, was paralyzed, unable to take his eyes off the scene unfolding right before him. And the customers, the same ones who minutes before were laughing or ignoring the homeless man, now watched in complete silence, trying to process what was happening. It was at that moment that Snoop Dogg, still with a calm posture, took the menu from the nearest table and handed it to the homeless man. His gesture was calm, unhurried, but full of meaning. He looked into the eyes of that man, who was hesitating, still suspicious, not knowing if all of this was real or if it was another one of those situations where hope appeared only to be ripped from his hands in the next second. "Are you hungry? So order what you want. I pay." The homeless man's eyes widened, as if his mind couldn't process those words. All his life he had learned that the world didn't work like that no one offered anything without expecting something in return, that there would always be a look of contempt, a muffled laugh, a lame excuse for him to be sent away. But now, one of the most recognized men in the world was there, speaking directly to him, giving him the right to choose anything on the menu. The seconds seemed to drag by in slow motion. The waiter looked at the manager, waiting for a reaction, waiting for some order that could get them out of that uncomfortable situation. But the manager didn't say anything. He just stared at Snoop Dogg with a blank expression, trying to understand how it had gotten out of control so quickly. Cell phones started to be held up. Customers discreetly took out their phones and started recording. Others were typing frantically, probably texting or posting what they were witnessing on Twitter. History was no longer restricted to those walls. In a few minutes, the whole world would know what was happening there. It was at that moment that Snoop Dogg, without any rush, raised his hands and took off his sunglasses. Then he pulled the hood of his sweatshirt back, completely revealing his face. The entire restaurant held its breath. The absolute silence was broken by a growing murmur, followed by small whispers of disbelief. The manager finally realized who was in front of him, and his face lost color. The waiter blinked several times, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "My God, it's Snoop Dogg," someone whispered. "It can't be," said another customer, mouth open. "I knew he looked familiar," a woman said, already holding the phone with shaking hands to film better. The manager felt his legs weaken for a moment. His heart raced. He had just pitted himself against one of the greatest living legends in music and pop culture. And worse, he had done it in a shameful way, in front of dozens of witnesses and cameras that captured every second of that disaster. The waiter, now clearly remorseful, tried to discreetly walk away, but his body seemed unresponsive. He felt trapped in his own mistake, in his own prejudice that led him to act without thinking. Snoop Dogg, on the other hand, remained calm. He didn't need to raise his voice to completely dominate that space. His presence spoke for itself. He looked at the manager, at the waiter, then turned his gaze to the homeless man, who was still holding the menu with shaking hands. "What's up, partner? What will you want?" he asked, as if nothing extraordinary was happening, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. The homeless man blinked, not knowing how to react. He looked at the menu options, but his mind was blank. It was as if, after so long without even imagining that he could choose something in a restaurant like that, he didn't know what to do. I I don't know, he said, his voice cracking. Snoop smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. Anything, brother. Whatever you want. Today is on me. The man swallowed hard, his eyes filling with tears. He looked at the menu once more, and then, as if he had just realized that this was real, he took a deep breath and chose. As he spoke his order, the waiter just listened, completely unresponsive. He looked at the manager, waiting for some instruction, some way to get out of this embarrassing situation, but the manager said nothing. He just stood there, motionless, watching his empire of arrogance crumble in front of everyone. Snoop Dogg looked at the waiter and raised his eyebrows. "Did you write it down?" The waiter swallowed hard and nodded slowly. I think so." "Great," said Snoop. "And also bring the most expensive dish you have. I want him to have the best meal of his life." Customers in the restaurant began to react. Some clapped softly, others simply laughed, in disbelief at what they were witnessing. The manager, realizing he was about to be completely destroyed on the internet, tried to regain control of the situation. Mr. Snoop Dogg began, trying to force a smile. I apologize for what happened. That was not our intention." Snoop Dogg stared at him for a second, then let out a short laugh and shook his head. "Are you apologizing because you realize who I am, or because you truly understand what you did wrong?" The manager opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked around, trying to find a way out, but it was too late now. Snoop Dogg sighed and sat back down next to the homeless man, completely ignoring the manager and waiter. He was there to make sure that man got the dinner he deserved, not to waste time with empty excuses. But what happened next? This took everyone by surprise, because the entire restaurant still had no idea of the real twist that was about to happen. Now tell me, what do you think should happen to this manager and this waiter? Do they deserve to be taught a lesson? Write the sentence in the comments. The world turns around if you believe no one should be treated this way. I read all the comments and want to know your opinion. And if you think this story has gone too far, so get ready. Because what happened after that scene meant that no one there would ever forget that night. If you think you've seen it all, haven't seen anything yet, the entire restaurant was still in shock. The manager and the waiter remained there paralyzed, trying to absorb what had just happened. They didn't know whether to look at Snoop Dogg, at the customers who were now whispering among themselves, or at the cell phones pointed at them, recording every second of that embarrassment. What once seemed like just another night on duty now turned into a true nightmare. And worst of all, they knew it wouldn't end there. Snoop Dogg was still sitting next to the homeless man, completely unconcerned, as if he hadn't just turned that restaurant upside down. He looked at the menu calmly, letting the man choose his dish, without rushing, without pressure. The homeless man, still stunned by the situation, held the menu with shaking hands. It was the first time in a long time that he had the freedom to choose something for himself. The whispers in the hall began to increase. Some people looked at the manager, waiting for an attitude, but he couldn't react. His face was red with embarrassment, and he seemed to be desperately searching for a way to get out of the situation with some dignity. But the truth was that there was no way out. He knew that the moment those recordings hit social media, his name and that of the restaurant would be in all the headlines. It was then that Snoop Dogg closed the menu and looked up at the manager. His gaze was calm but sharp. "You know something? I'm in a good mood today." The manager swallowed hard. He didn't know what to expect from that sentence. Snoop leaned back in his chair and tapped his fingers on the table for a moment, as if he was reflecting. Then he looked around the restaurant, observing the customers who were looking at him expectantly. "In fact, I think today is a great day to do something different." He took his wallet out of his pocket and placed a black card on the table, drawing everyone's attention. The manager looked at the card as if it were a sacred object. He knew exactly what that meant. It was then that Snoop Dogg smiled and dropped the bomb. "I pay everyone's bill here today." The restaurant erupted in a chorus of surprise. People looked at each other, trying to confirm if they had heard correctly. The manager opened his eyes wide, completely lost. The waiter opened his mouth to say something, but no sound came out. "That's right," Snoop continued. "Today all clients' bills are on me." Some people started to applaud. Others laughed in disbelief. A couple at the next table looked at each other, completely shocked. It was as if, from one moment to the next, the dinner had become a legendary event, something that no one there would ever forget. The manager, realizing that the situation had completely gotten out of his control, tried to regain some composure. "Mr. Snoop, I don't even know what to say. That's one. A very generous attitude." He tried to sound sincere, but it was clear he was desperate. He needed to get out of that situation well, or at least minimize the damage he had caused. Snoop just laughed lightly and shook his head. "Oh, you don't need to say anything, but there's one thing I want to do before I leave." He then reached into his pocket, pulling out a wad of bills. It was a lot of money, very much so. He set aside a generous amount and, before everyone's watchful eyes, placed the money in the homeless man's hands. "This is for you, partner." The homeless man looked at the bills in his hands, as if he was holding a piece of another world. His lower lip was trembling, his eyes were full of tears. He tried to say something, but the emotion was so great that his voice broke. He just nodded his thanks, unable to believe what was happening. "And there's more," continued Snoop. He turned to the waiter, who was already white as a sheet. "Normally, I leave tips for those who work properly, but today I'm going to do something different." The waiter stiffened, as if he knew something was about to happen. Snoop grabbed another wad of cash and handed it directly to the homeless man. "That's your tip. You deserve better than these guys here." The waiter lowered his head, embarrassed. The manager closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to process the damage. That's when the customers really started applauding. Claps echoed throughout the restaurant. Some people whistled, others shouted Snoop Dogg's name. The homeless man could no longer hold back his tears. He wiped his face with the back of his hands, still in disbelief that this was happening. I don't know what to say," he muttered. Snoop Dogg smiled and lightly slapped him on the shoulder. "Just enjoy it, brother. You deserve." The night, which had begun with a scene of humiliation and injustice, now turned into an unforgettable moment of poetic justice. The manager, having no further arguments, just stood there, knowing that anything he said would only make his situation worse. But what happened next? Oh, no one could have predicted that, because the restaurant hadn't seen the last of that night's surprises yet. Now tell me, if you were there, what would you do after that scene? Do you think the manager deserved an even greater punishment? Write the sentence here in the comments. Respect comes first, to show that no one should be treated this way. I read all the comments and want to know your opinion, and if you think this story has already reached its peak, so hold on. Because what happened after that sent the entire restaurant into shock. If you think you've seen it all, wait until you see what comes next. The entire restaurant was still buzzing with the energy of the moment. That place, which was once a symbol of exclusivity and arrogance, now faced a scene that no one would ever forget. The homeless man, still with shaking hands, held the money that Snoop Dogg had given him. His eyes were teary, emotion overflowed in every expression, and his breathing was irregular, as if his body was still trying to understand that this wasn't a dream. He opened his mouth a few times, trying to find words, but his voice wouldn't come out. All he could do was look at Snoop with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. The rapper smiled and lightly patted the man on the shoulder. "It's okay, partner. Today life decided to give you a gift. Just enjoy it." Snoop's words seemed to break the homeless man's last shred of emotional resistance. He couldn't hold back the tears any longer. His body shook and he shook his head, as if telling himself that this couldn't be happening. But it was. For the first time in a long time, he felt like someone saw him, not as a nuisance, not as a problem, but as a human being. The applause continued. Some people filmed, others just smiled, still surprised by what they were witnessing. But there was something in the air, something greater than the shock of the situation. It was a feeling of justice, that for the first time, that restaurant had been the scene of something truly significant. The manager, pale, was still standing in the same place. His mind was working overtime, trying to find a way out, some way to fix this. But he knew there was nothing more that could be done. The humiliation he imposed on the homeless man was now his own humiliation. He looked around, saw cell phones pointed at him, and realized His image was tarnished, and the worst. There was no one to blame but himself. He tried to force a nervous smile and approached Snoop Dogg, extending his hand. "Mr. Snoop, I just wanted to say that. I apologize if there was any misunderstanding." Snoop looked at the manager's outstretched hand, and then at his face. His smile diminished. The restaurant fell silent once again, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for an answer. The rapper didn't take the manager's hand. Instead, he crossed his arms and shook his head. "Misunderstanding," he repeated, as if testing the word. "Dude, you treated a man like dirt because you thought he wasn't good enough for your restaurant. That wasn't a misunderstanding. It was your choice." The manager swallowed hard, trying not to show his despair. Snoop continued, his voice firm but not needing to get excited. "Respect everyone, not because they may be famous, but because they are human beings." The silence was broken by more applause. Some customers nodded, completely impacted by the scene. This wasn't just a random moment, it was a lesson, one that would never be forgotten. The manager slowly lowered his hand, realizing that any attempt to redeem himself there would be in vain. He had been exposed. There were no more excuses. Snoop Dogg, without further ado, took one last look at the homeless man, who was still holding the money as if he was afraid it would all disappear at any moment. "Take care, brother," said the rapper, before taking a step back and turning to leave. But before he walked through the door, he stopped and looked at the waiter, who couldn't even look up. "And you? Are you going to continue treating people this way, or have you learned something today?" The waiter opened his mouth, but no words came out. He knew that no matter what he said now, it wouldn't change what had already happened. So he just lowered his head and nodded slowly. Snoop Dogg didn't wait any longer. With calm steps and an unwavering posture, he crossed the restaurant and walked out the door, and that's where it all started. Customers who were filming immediately began uploading the videos on social media. Within minutes, the first tweets began to go viral. Headlines on gossip and pop culture sites appeared in record time. "Snoop Dogg humiliates arrogant manager and teaches a lesson about respect. Poetic Justice restaurant tries to evict a homeless man, but Snoop Dogg turns the table. Waiter humiliates poor man and regrets it bitterly when he finds out who was watching." The videos started to spread, first on Twitter, then on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook. Within hours, the images had already reached millions of views. Celebrities commented, influencers reacted to the event. The restaurant, which was previously known only for its luxury, was now synonymous with prejudice and arrogance. But, among all the posts, the one that moved people the most was the photo of the homeless man holding the money with a shy smile on his face. He still looked like he couldn't believe what had happened. His story, which no one wanted to hear before, was now being told to the entire world. In the comments of the posts, thousands of people shared their own experiences. Some talked about being humiliated for their appearance. Others celebrated Snoop Dogg's attitude and said that the world needed more people like him. And while the internet was on fire with this story, one question was in the air. And now, what happened to the manager, with the waiter? And most importantly, what happened to the homeless man after that night? If you have ever witnessed an unfair situation like this, write the phrase here in the comments, "Respect comes before everything," to show that you support this cause. I read all the comments and want to know your opinion, and if you think this story is over. So get ready, because what happened after that left everyone's jaw dropped. If you thought this night was already unforgettable, just wait until you see what happened next. And now, I want to hear from you. If this story made you reflect, if you believe that respect is worth more than appearance, that dignity is priceless, and that every person deserves to be treated with humanity, then show me that you are here. Write the sentence in the comments, "Respect is worth more than luxury," to show that you support this message and that this type of attitude cannot be tolerated. And if you've watched this far, leave a like, because this helps the channel reach more people with stories like this. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos, because I guarantee there's still a lot of impactful history, full of twists and turns and poetic justice coming. Now, before leaving, click on the next video that is already appearing on the screen. If you thought this story was unbelievable, wait until you see the next one, because it will surprise you even more.